Hello there, reefers and future reefers. I'm Bana Sophia. Welcome back to my channel. We've been talking about my Studio 12 all-in-one 12-gallon aquarium and saltwater setup kit from Reef Casa. This time we'll be talking about some essential things to know and do during the first 1 to 3 weeks after you set up a saltwater aquarium. We will also be talking about this XP Aqua Duetto ATO or auto top-off and how to install it on an aquarium. If you're tuning in specifically for the ATO, I will include the time so you can skip ahead here. So I got the tank wet about 2 weeks ago. I added the Reef Casa beneficial bacteria and ammonium chloride, and I've been testing the ammonia, nitrite, and nitrate levels every few days to monitor the progress with the cycle. I will talk more about the nitrogen cycle on my future video, but the thing to know for now is that we still have ammonia and nitrite present in the tank, so it's not cycled yet and no livestock can be added. Remember, when you're doing a fishless cycle and you add ammonia to the tank, you can't add any livestock until the ammonia and the nitrite go to 0 because ammonia and nitrite can be toxic to fish. So you really have to wait until ammonia and nitrite go down to 0 and then you can add your livestock. Reef Casa had indicated that their beneficial bacteria product and ammonium chloride typically can cycle a tank in about 2 to 3 weeks. I was hoping for 2 weeks because I'm excited to add my fish. But to be honest, there's lots to do to research and decide on as you're starting up a tank. So I have plenty to keep me busy in the meantime. Right, so the things you need to do in this first 1 to 3 week period. Yes, you need to make sure your tank is cycled, but also you need to make sure that all of your equipment is functioning properly. First of all, you need to make sure there are no leaks on the tank. Also, you need to make sure you have the GFCI outlet protection and a good power strip with a surge protector for plugging in all of your components for your tank. In addition, you need to make sure that your pump is working and the water flow is good. If you have a power head, you can also check that and make sure that's working, but you don't have to add a power head at this stage. The flow is really high from this pump, so it may not even need a power head. I will determine that as I add my corals and I'm able to better see what the flow is like in this tank. In addition, you want to check and make sure your heater is working, your thermometer is working, and your light is working. Once you know your equipment's functioning properly, you also just need to make sure you can maintain a stable environment in your tank. That means making sure your temperature stays stable, your water level, and your salinity in your tank. All of those things need to be kept stable in a reef tank to keep your fish and any other livestock safe and happy. Temperature, this tank is easy. I typically keep my tanks in the 76 to 80 degree Fahrenheit range, and the thermometer and heater that came with the Reef Casa saltwater setup kit work perfectly for this setup. They've been maintaining my temperature at the 78 degrees I set the tank to with no problem. It's important to remember you do not want to put your heater in the return chamber of your tank, as this is the chamber that could have a drop in the water level with evaporation, and you always want your heater to remain submerged. Another important note here is that the temperature control is easy with this Studio 12 tank, which is an open top tank that just has a mesh lid, but you may need to take additional steps to keep the temperature stable if you're using a tank with a solid lid, such as a BioCube. I'll plan to talk more about that in a future video, but let's keep it simple today and focus on this type of tank. You may have heard people say we aren't really keeping fish and corals in this hobby, we're keeping water. Needless to say, being able to maintain the water level in our tanks is key. During the first week or two with a new tank setup, you want to see what happens with the water level over time. Remember how much you initially filled your tank. With a Studio 12 tank, we want to run it so that the water level is about 1 inch below the baffle in the third chamber. First, you want to be watching for any leaks with the tank. If there was a leak in a brand new tank, I would probably follow up with the manufacturer or the place I bought the tank. But in an older tank that develops a leak, you may need to fix or replace your tank. In most cases though, if the water level is dropping, the issue is not a leak, it's evaporation. I may get a little nerdy here because I love science, and I love that there's so much science involved in reefing. Remember learning about the hydrologic cycle or the water cycle in science? Well, just like evaporation that happens with the ocean, there's also evaporation from our reef tanks. But in a tank with no lid, the water vapor can't condense. No tiny rain clouds will form over our tanks, so the water escapes in the form of vapor and the water level drops in the tank. This water needs to be replaced. We need to be like a river, replenishing the water in our tiny ocean. But what's the big thing to remember here? When water evaporates from the ocean and from our tanks, what happens to the salt and minerals and other stuff dissolved in the salt water? It stays behind. So in our tanks, as the water evaporates, the salt gets left behind. And then what does that do to the salinity level in the tank? It increases it. This is a really important concept in reefing. We have to replace the evaporated water to maintain the water level and maintain a stable salinity level. And since only the water itself evaporates, we need to replace it with fresh water, not salt water. If you added salt water back each time, the water alone would continue to evaporate, leaving a little extra salt behind in the tank each time, and the salinity would be building up higher and higher over time. You can't have this in a reef tank. The salinity level or concentration of salts in the salt water has to stay stable in a certain range to support our livestock. This also explains why you want to make sure you're using pure water, H2O, which can be RODI water that you can filter yourself if you have your own RODI filter, or you can buy from your local fish store or LFS. Or you can use distilled water, which you can usually get at a grocery store or drugstore. Just make sure it's not that baby distilled water that has minerals added back in. I actually get Arrowhead distilled water delivered to my house in 5-gallon reusable jugs once a month, which I really like because they take back and reuse the jug, so it reduces plastic waste. So 2 types of water are good, RODI or distilled. You typically do not want to use tap water for topping off because tap water is likely to have impurities that would also be left behind in the tank during the evaporation process and would build up over time. For example, here's a sample of my tap water. We can use a TDS meter to see the amount of total dissolved solids in a sample of water. We don't know what those solids actually are, and they may not hurt anything at first because it'll probably only be a really small amount. But over time, as more water evaporates and more of these impurities get left behind and build up, they could have a negative effect on the livestock in the tank. Compare that TDS level to what you see in the distilled water that came from my local grocery store. The amount of evaporation depends on a number of different factors, including surface area, water flow rate, water temperature, room temperature and humidity in your house, airflow around your tank, and heat from your light. Check out this cool graphic from BRS, which shows evaporation and the setup of an auto top-off. I'll link the article below, and I recommend checking it out. With my Studio 12 tank, I've been replacing about 1 to 2 cups of water each day. Every setup is different though. My BioCubes don't get any significant evaporation due to their lids, for example, so they typically do not need any topping off between water changes. That's why you really need to watch your tank during the first couple of weeks after setting it up to see how the water level changes and figure out what measures you need to take to maintain the water level and salinity in your particular tank. If your tank does get evaporation, there are 2 main options. You can do manual top-offs. You'll want to mark the tank's desired water level and check it and manually add the distilled or RODI top-off water as needed. That's what I've been doing so far with this tank, checking and adding water once or twice a day. I would estimate I do add about 1 to 2 cups of top-off water daily. If I were to forget for just one day, the return chamber and pump would likely run dry, which is not good. Plus, take a look at what happens to the salinity in the tank from just one day of evaporation. It goes from 1.025, which I'm normally keeping it at, to 1.026 before I top it off. We really want to keep things more stable than that. So that leads to the second option and my recommendation, which is to use an automatic top-off or ATO. An ATO will add the water in the form of the top-offs throughout the day rather than waiting until you check on the tank. There are different types of ATOs out there, including some that work by gravity and some that are electronic. Most people use the electronic ATOs these days, and that's what I've always used. ATOs use sensors to monitor the water level and will add the top-off water automatically as needed throughout the day. I've also used the XPAqua Smart Micro ATO on 2 Nano tanks, and it worked really great for me. It wasn't available through Amazon this time around, so I decided to go with the XP Aqua Duetto instead. I got it from Amazon, but it's also available from Reef Casa, so you could order one along with the tank. In my opinion, an ATO really is one of the most important pieces of equipment for a nano tank to keep things stable if you have a tank with evaporation. So I highly recommend investing in one and setting it up early on to help with the success and stability of your tank. Next, let me show you how I set up my Duetto ATO for this tank. Before I do that though, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Since I'm just starting out, it really makes a difference. Here we go with the unboxing and setup of the Duetto ATO. You can see all the parts that are included, which are the controller, plug, pump, hose mounting device, siphon brake, and tubing. As it mentions here, it actually has dual optical sensors for increased safety. That's why it's called the Duetto, and they say that this is the world's smallest dual sensor ATO. Other important features include that the mounting thickness is 1/2 inch and the head or lift for the pump is 8.2 feet. There's a diagram on the back of the box that shows the installation. Be sure to read the instructions. They're written very clearly for this device. There's a great diagram, and they include safety measures you should not skip over. There are some risks with using an ATO. An ATO can malfunction or be set up wrong, and it can either overfill or drain your tank, sometimes by siphoning into or out of your tank. So choosing a good one and setting up correctly is really important. Because of that, don't just go by what I say. Read the directions that come with it, do your research, and check out other sources of information. I'm no expert. I'm really just sharing information that I think will be helpful, especially to new reefers. Notice that the ATO does not include the reservoir for keeping the water. You can buy an ATO reservoir or use some other kind of container as long as it will not leach anything into the water over time. I use one of these 2-gallon jugs, which I found on Amazon. They came in a set of 4, and I use the others for storing and carrying saltwater and RODI water. They're made of HDPE food-grade plastic. I also drilled 2 holes in the lid for passing the tubing and plug through. This is the dual sensor. You want to make sure you install it correctly in your tank with the cord facing upward. It has 2 sensors, the main sensor at the bottom and a fail-safe sensor at the top, so the orientation matters. You can see it has a strong magnet here, and that's what you use to attach it to the tank. Also, you can see there's a controller with visual and audible alerts. It tells you a number of different things, including when it runs low, also when it hasn't filled at all in 72 hours. Both the power supply and the pump will be plugged into the bottom of the controller once everything's all set up. The head or lift of the pump is about 8 feet. That's really important to know if your tank's going to be up high. You need to make sure that the pump can lift the water all the way up to the tank. So here you can see the dual sensor mounted at the normal water level in the return chamber of the tank, using the magnet on the outside of the tank. According to the directions for this device, the refill tubing should not go in the same chamber as the sensor, so I'm putting it in the middle chamber. Very important. The tip of your refill tubing should never dip into the tank water, or it can cause a back siphon. You want to make sure that the tip is high enough that it will never touch the tank water, both when the tank is running and when the pump is turned off for doing water changes or feedings, because in many tanks, including this one, the water level changes when the pump is running versus when it's turned off. Watch what happens with the water level in the back chambers of this tank when I turn off the pump. By the way, don't worry about that foamy substance and the sand residue that you're seeing in the tank right now. I think that came from the live sand I used. That should clear up once I add the filter floss to the tank. Right now I'm not using any filter floss since I'm still cycling the tank. So you can see that the tip of the refill tubing is quite close to the level of the water in the tank. So I'm going to adjust the tubing so it's not as close. Again, we really don't want a back siphon. That's when a siphon can form and the water in your tank can go back into your ATO reservoir. I think that siphon break would probably prevent that from happening, but better to be on the safe side. Next, let's look at what we need to do with the other end of the tubing. You're going to attach the tubing to the pump like this, and then you need to insert the pump and tubing into your ATO reservoir to determine where you're going to install that siphon break piece. The siphon break must be inside your ATO reservoir, but it has to be installed so it will always be above the level of your top-off water. Also, the direction of the siphon break piece is important. You want to make it so that the arrow is pointing upward in the direction your top-off water will flow. Also, there will be a little piece or a little part of that siphon break piece where there's a hole and the water drips out through there and air enters in. So that always needs to drip into your reservoir and be above the level of the top-off water. So I just figured out where I wanted to install it, cut it with some scissors, and then inserted the siphon break piece into the 2 ends of the tubing, and then checked to make sure the position was good once I was done. Next, I just connected both the DC pump and the power adapter with the controller. And then I plugged in the plug, but I did not turn it on yet because remember, I don't have any water in my reservoir yet. So I didn't turn it on yet. I filled my ATO reservoir with my distilled water until it was about a half full. I could have filled it up more than that if I had more distilled water. You just want to make sure that you do not fill it above the level of that siphon break piece. Here you can take a closer look at the siphon break piece. On the left, you see the air inlet / water outlet, and then there you can see the arrow pointing upward in the direction your top-off water will go toward your tank. Once you're ready to plug in the ATO, be sure you have a drip loop. And if you don't know about drip loops or GFCI protection that I mentioned earlier, you can check out my previous video that talks about electrical considerations when keeping an aquarium. Let's power it on, and you can see the controller turns on and the LED and an audible alert indicate the status. It looks like it's working. I won't have to turn the ATO off during feeding when I turn the pump off because remember, the water level rose up higher in the back chamber on this tank over the level of the sensor, so it won't be triggered to fill. But I will need to remember to turn off the ATO during a water change when I remove actual salt water from the tank. During a water change, we're removing the dirty salt water and we have to replace it with new salt water. We do not want the ATO to get triggered when the water level drops in the tank. And we don't want it to refill the tank with a pure distilled top-off water that would dilute the salt water and could kill our livestock. So be sure you always turn off the ATO anytime you do a water change until the tank gets refilled with the new salt water and is up and running again. You want to turn on your pump and make sure you added enough new salt water so that the water level is in the correct place in the back of the tank, 1 inch below the baffle in the third chamber. Only then can you turn your ATO back on again. So that's how you set it up. Continue to keep an eye on the ATO after you set it up, making sure it's functioning as expected. You'll want to figure out about how often you have to refill the reservoir so you can try and stay on top of it, though it does have the audible alert. I typically check mine during weekly water changes. Now that we know that the temperature, salinity, and water level can be maintained, the equipment is all working, and I've set up my halo light according to the recommendations on the Reef Casa website. It's all looking good. I'm waiting for the cycle to complete, checking my ammonia, nitrite, and nitrate levels daily since I'm getting close. If I didn't already have my first fish waiting to be relocated into this tank, I would be searching fish options right now and deciding on my first 1 to 2 small fish to add once the cycle is complete. Adding fish will be the next step. Great places to look while deciding on your fish for your nano tank include this book, The 101 Best Nano Reef Species, and the Live Aquaria website. Since nano tanks are so small, you're very limited as far as what fish and how many you can add to your tank. So as you're deciding, you may want to think about fish that you can add that not only look beautiful or interesting, but also think about choosing fish that will be able to do different jobs in the tank, such as eating pests and algae. You also want to choose fish that will be pretty hardy and will get along with each other. All right, so I will talk more about my stocking ideas and adding my first fish to this tank in my next video. So stay tuned and happy reefing.